Deep in a clay quarry outside Vladimir, Russia, in the winter of 1969, a bulldozer operator hit something that stopped the machines. Beneath the frozen soil lay two children, a boy and a girl, laid head to head in a single grave. They were not simply buried. They were entombed beneath more than 10,000 ivory beads, each one hand-carved from mammoth tusk, each one taking roughly 45 minutes to shape with stone tools in the depths of an ice age. At 45 minutes per bead, even 10,000 of them represent something close to 7,500 hours of work, spent by people who were fighting the coldest, hungriest conditions our species has ever endured. It looked, on the surface, completely unnecessary. Food mattered. Shelter mattered. Fire mattered. Why would anyone spend that much time on something that did none of those things? That question sits at the center of everything that follows. Because these beads weren't isolated to one grave, or one culture, or even one species of human. Long before Sangir, long before Europe had modern humans at all, something else was already happening, in a different place entirely. And it means the story you think you're about to watch doesn't begin where you'd expect. By the end of this film, you'll understand why one way to think about certain beads is as the first hard drives our species ever built, why a single shell's shape may once have told a stranger where you belonged before you spoke a word, and why those two children in Russia may not have been buried in decoration at all. But in something closer to a message, this wasn't where the story began. Thousands of kilometers south, on a wind-scoured stretch of South Africa's coastline, sits a modest cave called Blombos. In 1991, archaeologists began sifting through its floor, layer by layer, and deep in sediment, tens of thousands of years older than any known cave painting, they found something that shouldn't have been there. 41 tiny shells, each pierced clean through with a hole. Dated to roughly 75,000 years ago, they're among the earliest known evidence of personal ornament making anywhere on Earth. Before humans are known to have drawn a single recognizable image, they were already threading shells onto string. At first glance, that could still be nothing more than early jewelry. But the holes told archaeologists something the shells alone couldn't. Under a microscope, the edges showed smoothing and wear, consistent with rubbing against cord and skin over time. Not damage from the sea, but damage from being worn. Some carried faint traces of red ochre pigment. These weren't shells someone had simply picked up. They'd been strung, worn, maybe even restrung, again and again, for years. Somebody was choosing to carry this weight on their body, day after day, on purpose, and then the timeline broke completely. Blombos had already pushed the origin of this behavior back 75,000 years. Then a cave in Morocco pushed it back again, by nearly another 70,000. Shell beads recovered from Bizmoune Cave in southwest Morocco and published in 2021 came from deposits dated to as much as 142,000 years old, making them the oldest shell beads yet recovered anywhere. Whatever these objects were doing for their makers, they weren't a late invention, added once survival got easier. They may be one of the very first things we ever did that made us who we are. So what were they actually for? This is where the story stops being about shells and starts being about something closer to language. Christopher Henshelwood, the archaeologist behind the Blombos excavation, proposed an idea that still unsettles people in his field, that a strung sequence of beads could function the way a written record later would, a way of holding meaning outside a living human brain, readable by anyone who understood the code, long after the person who made it was gone. Before writing, before tally marks, before anything we'd recognize as a symbol system, humans may already have been encoding information onto cord. If that's true, it raises an obvious next question. What kind of information? A team led by researcher Marian van Haren tried to answer exactly that, comparing thousands of beads recovered from dozens of Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe. What emerged was a pattern too consistent to be accidental. Communities living even a few hundred kilometers apart favored distinct shell types, distinct sizes, distinct ways of stringing them, almost like regional accents, but worn instead of spoken. Meet a stranger on an Ice Age landscape, and before either of you said a word, their beads may have already told you where they were likely from, and whether you shared kin, allies, or rivals in common. It's worth saying plainly that not everything here is settled. Some claims of Neanderthal ornament making remain genuinely contested, and not every ancient perforated shell was necessarily worn by a human hand at all. But across dozens of sites, spanning over 100,000 years, the evidence increasingly suggests Personal ornaments were doing more than simple decoration, and suddenly, those two children in Russia looked different. Anthropologist Eric Trinkhaus and colleagues examined their skeletons and found signs of real physical hardship: unusually short, bowed thigh bones in one child, developmental stress recorded in both sets of teeth. These were children who had endured significant hardship, and yet they went into the ground more heavily beaded than any adult found at the site. Thousands of collective hours of labor wrapped around two vulnerable children. If beads could carry identity, could declare belonging, could say who you were to anyone who saw them, then burying a child in 10,000 of them wasn't waste. It was the loudest possible way a Stone Age community had to say this person mattered, and we want that fact to outlast us. A stranger can lie with words. It's much harder to lie with 7,500 hours of carved ivory. That's the thought worth carrying back to that clay quarry outside Vladimir. And the two children who never grew old enough to speak for themselves. Their community didn't spend an Ice Age winter on empty decoration. They may have been building the only kind of message that could survive them, carved for the first time, tens of thousands of years earlier, into a handful of drilled shells on an African coastline. The first message humans learned to wear wasn't "look at me." It was "this is who I am, and these are my people."